flipped the entire cabin and exposed everything Karen thought she could hide behind a smile. She didn't scream. She didn't stand. But in that stillness, she shattered a mask worn by millions. By the time the plane landed, Karen's badge was gone. The footage had gone global, and Jasmine had become the face of a movement that forced America to look in the mirror. What did she say, in less than 10 words, that turned quiet prejudice into worldwide outrage? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The departure hall at LAX thrummed like a living organism, fast-moving, polished, impersonal. Overhead, announcements crackled through steel beams and glass panels, boarding calls layered over flight delays, merging into a relentless drone of urgency. But then, in the midst of all that velocity, one figure moved differently. Not faster, not louder, just steadier. A black woman in a crisp black blouse, dark jeans, and worn leather flats stepped through the tide like it didn't touch her. Her presence didn't beg attention. It simply refused to shrink. Hair tied back with quiet elegance, eyes sharp beneath the soft curl of her lashes, she gave off the kind of calm that suggested not peace but discipline. The calm of someone who's had to master silence, because speaking has too often cost her more than it helped. Around her neck, nearly hidden beneath the collar of her blouse, swung a silver crucifix. Small, dulled by time, edges worn soft by use. It didn't shimmer. It wasn't designer. It looked lived in, prayed over, held in trembling fingers on nights when sleep felt like a luxury and survival felt like defiance. A businessman looked up from his tablet, caught a glimpse of the necklace, and blinked twice. His eyes lingered just a moment too long, not in admiration, but calculation. A woman in stilettos clutching a Louis Vuitton bag leaned slightly into her partner, whispering behind a forced smile. Jasmine heard none of the words, but she didn't need to. She'd learned to read the tones long ago. The tight politeness, the frozen smiles, the tone-deaf surprise when someone like her walked somewhere someone like her didn't belong. But Jasmine Crockett had walked through worse doors, and this one, labeled first-class priority, was just another threshold. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, head held high, and moved forward with a gait carved from courtrooms, campaigns, and quiet fights that never made headlines. She didn't demand space. She was space, the kind that made others uncomfortable, not because it shouted, but because it didn't apologize. Then came the interruption. A voice, sharp, polished, and utterly unmistakable in its passive challenge, cut through the ambient noise like a gate closing in real time. "Ma'am," it said, not with concern, but with suspicion wrapped in civility. The woman behind the gate, flight attendant, uniform pressed, name tag crisp, Karen, stood rigid, posture straight as a ruler, her smile frozen, just short of human warmth. Her eyes scanned Jasmine not as a passenger, but as a problem. And she didn't start with Jasmine's face. She started with the cross. The attendant's gaze dropped to the necklace first, locked onto it like it was contraband, before crawling slowly upward to meet Jasmine's eyes, now unreadable. "Are you sure you're at the right gate?" Karen asked, voice coded in the kind of rehearsed professionalism that people like Jasmine had been navigating all their lives. It was the tone that said, "I'm not yelling, but I'm judging," the tone that wraps itself in rules to excuse the prejudice hiding underneath. Jasmine didn't blink. She reached into her satchel with deliberate ease and pulled out a first-class boarding pass embossed in navy and gold. She held it up without a word, hand steady. LAX to Washington, D.C., first class. Passenger, Jasmine Crockett. Bold, undeniable, and as legitimate as the silence that followed. Karen took it like it was a counterfeit, scanned it like it couldn't possibly be real. Everything matched. Everything was correct. But when she handed it back, she still wouldn't look Jasmine in the eye. And somehow, that said more than any words ever could. Jasmine offered a small, practiced smile, not out of amusement, but out of sheer survival. A smile that said, "I know what this is. I've lived this script before." She stepped forward without another word, and behind her the weight of a quiet injustice lingered in the air, unspoken, unchallenged, but heavy enough that even gravity seemed to notice. And as Jasmine stepped into the cabin, ticket verified but tension unresolved, it was clear the judgment hadn't stayed at the gate. It had followed her in, quietly tightening around her like cabin pressure before takeoff. Seat 2A welcomed her with the sterile comfort of premium leather and polished metal. But even as Jasmine sank into it, upright and composed, she could feel it, the weight of eyes. She didn't pull out a laptop, didn't adjust her seat, didn't even reach for a drink. She simply sat, hands folded, gaze straight ahead. But across the aisle, Karen watched her like a glitch in the system, eyes locked not on her face, but on the crucifix that now rested plainly against her chest. The necklace caught the soft cabin light with a dull gleam. Old silver, familiar to her skin, foreign to Karen's sensibilities. The flight attendant leaned toward a junior crew member, her voice barely above a whisper but razor sharp. "That doesn't exactly fit the image of first class," she muttered, the disdain hidden behind a customer service smile. The junior attendant said nothing, just blinked, unsure whether to nod or vanish. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing, did nothing, but that only made her presence feel louder. A man 2 rows back looked up from his tablet. A woman across the aisle adjusted her scarf, but didn't stop watching. Something unspoken had entered the cabin, and everyone could feel it. The cabin had quieted, but beneath its calm hum, something unspoken pulsed. Until Karen moved, heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle, her hands folded just right, her mouth rehearsing a smile that had nothing to do with kindness. She approached Jasmine's seat with the smooth, practiced gait of someone trained to appear polite even when they were drawing a line. Her presence cast a different kind of silence over the row, the kind that made people sit a little straighter, hold their breath just a second longer. When she stopped beside Jasmine, she tilted her head slightly and dropped her voice to a tone meant to sound professional. But it carried the stiffness of someone correcting a mistake she had already decided was out of place. "Ma'am," she began, that artificial softness coating each word, "we usually ask passengers in our premium cabins to limit visible religious symbols, just for the comfort of everyone on board." She smiled again, too wide, and gestured not directly at Jasmine's crucifix, but somewhere in its general direction, like she didn't want to touch it, or maybe like she didn't want to be caught pointing. "We try to maintain a neutral environment up here," she added as if that explained everything. Her voice was calm, but her posture was firm, sending the message underneath the words, "This doesn't belong here. You don't belong here." But Jasmine didn't do small, not anymore. She turned slightly in her seat, her eyes meeting Karen's without an ounce of anger, just the kind of calm that comes from a woman who's had to explain her existence more times than she can count. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. "I've worn this cross," she said slowly, every word deliberate, "in ICU rooms, while holding the hands of people taking their last breaths. I've worn it during congressional hearings where I was under attack not for what I said, but for who I was. I've worn it in courtrooms where the law bent more often than it stood, and not once did it offend anyone." She didn't blink, didn't shift. Her fingers rested calmly on the armrest, the silver crucifix lying still over her chest, unmoved by turbulence or tension. Karen, on the other hand, did shift, subtly but noticeably. Her smile faltered for half a second before she caught it and reassembled her face into something neutral again. But the heat behind her eyes had changed. It was no longer about a policy. Now it was personal. "Well," she said, voice tighter now, less syrup, more sting, "some passengers have said it makes them uncomfortable." It was the phrase that always came next, the one that made bigotry sound like customer service. Some passengers. The invisible backup dancers to every act of quiet exclusion. The anonymous majority used to justify silencing the visible minority. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She just looked at Karen for a long moment, not with pity, not with challenge, just clarity. Like she was seeing the script for what it was, and choosing not to play along. Her silence said more than any speech ever could. "You're not protecting them. You're protecting a fragile version of comfort that only works if I disappear." Across the aisle, a man adjusted his seat, just enough to tilt his phone camera discreetly toward the scene. No dramatic moves, no flash, no sound. just a quiet decision to document. Another passenger, a woman in her 40s with a worn copy of The Atlantic in her lap, stopped reading and watched. The air was shifting, not violently, but undeniably. The kind of shift you feel when something unjust is happening and no one is screaming, because the injustice doesn't need volume to be real. She didn't move quickly. She didn't shift in her seat or adjust her blouse or tilt her chin the way some people do when they want to command attention. She didn't need to. Jasmine simply turned her head, slow and steady, until her eyes met Karen's again. Her voice, when it came, was even and grounded. Not loud, not theatrical, but carrying the weight of 1,000 similar moments. "The issue," she said, each word crystal clear, "is not what's hanging around my neck. The issue is what's showing in your eyes." The sentence didn't need volume. It carried its own gravity. It was the kind of line that doesn't land like a punch. It lands like a verdict. And when it did, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. No one laughed. No one muttered a thing. The sound of ice settling in a glass somewhere in row 4 felt unnaturally loud. The tension in the room didn't spike. It sank. Deep. Heavy. Like everyone suddenly realized they were no longer watching a small disagreement, but standing in the middle of something real. Karen didn't speak. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her face, always perfectly composed, began to crack at the edges. Her lips tightened, her jaw flexed, and a subtle flush began to crawl up her neck and into her cheeks. She was used to being in control, to managing situations, to leaning on protocol when things got uncomfortable. But there was no script for this, no manual entry that covered what to do when the woman you tried to diminish simply refused to make herself smaller. Her hands gripped the tablet in front of her, like it might anchor her to something, anything. But it didn't help. Her authority, her posture, her uniform, none of it was enough to stop what had just happened. Because Jasmine hadn't accused her. She hadn't made a scene. She had simply named the truth and made it impossible for Karen to hide behind procedure. And around them, eyes were watching. Not in that casual, half-interested way people sometimes observe drama on a plane. This was different. This was still intentional. A businessman in row 3B slowly lowered the magazine he hadn't actually been reading. A woman across the aisle, mid-30s, elegant in a quiet way, paused mid-sip, her cup frozen halfway to her lips. A teenage boy toward the front leaned forward just slightly, phone now resting flat on his tray table. Camera aimed without motion. No one said anything. No one needed to. The silence said everything. They heard it. They saw it. And now they knew. Something had shifted, and not in words this time. It was in Karen's posture, her breathing, the way her eyes narrowed like a cornered animal. The mask of professionalism had finally slipped. "Then I'll help you take it off," Karen snapped, her voice stripped of politeness, sharp with something raw and deeply unmasked. The sentence cut across the cabin like a blade, too loud for comfort, too deliberate to be anything but personal. Her hand lunged forward, sudden and unhinged, reaching toward Jasmine's chest, fingers aiming straight for the crucifix that lay quietly against her blouse. It happened fast, so fast that the air itself seemed to recoil. Jasmine instinctively leaned back, her spine pressing into the seat, shoulders tensing, a flash of disbelief and control flooding her eyes. She didn't scream. She didn't swat the hand away. She just froze, body still, mind moving a mile a minute, locked between instinct and dignity. All around them, the cabin dropped into stunned silence. The air turned cold. A woman in 2C gasped and half rose from her seat. A child nearby stopped mid-conversation with his mother, lips parted. One man dropped his in-flight magazine without noticing. Another passenger's phone, which had been casually recording in his lap, now rose just slightly, frame locked on Karen's outstretched hand. This wasn't discomfort anymore. It was danger. It was something far more serious than a policy dispute, and everyone knew it. Then click. The sound of the cockpit door unlocking sliced through the tension like a lightning strike on metal. The thick cabin door flung open hard, crashing against the stopper. Out stepped Captain Morales, tall, composed, jaw clenched, eyes blazing. His uniform was spotless, but his voice was anything but sterile. "Stop. Right. Now. The words didn't need to be shouted. They hit like a shockwave. Karen's hand froze in midair, suspended inches from Jasmine's crucifix, trembling as if it had touched electricity. Her entire body stiffened, mouth parting slightly, but she said nothing. Couldn't. The spell had been broken, and she was caught in the act. Every passenger was now watching her, not with curiosity, but disbelief, judgment, fear. A line had been crossed, and they all felt it, viscerally. Jasmine, still seated, slowly straightened her posture. She didn't say a word, didn't look at Karen. Her breathing was calm, controlled, her eyes locked on Captain Morales. The weight of the moment didn't crush her, it framed her. And beside her, the crucifix remained exactly where it had been all along. Still, undisturbed, and now sacred in a way no one in that cabin would ever forget. Karen's hand was still suspended in the space between offense and regret when the captain's voice sliced through the moment, sharp, surgical, and impossible to ignore. Captain Morales didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He moved like a man who had seen enough and heard too much. His footsteps were deliberate, each one landing with the weight of final judgment. The line between the cockpit and the center of the storm closed quickly. His gaze never left Karen, not for a second, not even to scan the stunned passengers or glance at the recording phones. His eyes were locked onto her like crosshairs, his face an iron mask. "I've been monitoring the cabin camera feed since the first report," he said, his voice low but pulsing with restrained authority. "What I just witnessed, your tone, your aggression, your physical attempt to make contact with a seated passenger, is unacceptable. There was no room left for interpretation, no vague phrasing, no softened language to cushion the truth. The cabin didn't move. Even the lights seemed dimmer. Karen didn't speak. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her throat moved, swallowing something sharp and bitter. Pride, maybe, or the realization that she had just crossed a line no uniform could shield her from. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was loaded. Every eye was on her. Passengers who had once ignored her presence now stared as if seeing her for the first time, not as staff, but as threat. Her arms dropped slowly to her sides. The hand that had reached for Jasmine's crucifix now hovered awkwardly in the air, fingers twitching with nervous memory. A woman in row 4 clasped her husband's hand. A teenager stopped recording, not out of boredom, but because the weight of the moment demanded attention, not evidence. This was no longer a customer service issue. It was something bigger. And Captain Morales stood squarely in the center of it. Without breaking eye contact, Morales reached down and unhooked the radio clip to his belt. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. But every word felt like a legal order read aloud in a courtroom. "Flight deck to cabin crew," he said. "Effective immediately. Attendant Karen is suspended from active duty. I am instructing her to surrender her crew badge and report to the aft galley until further notice. Security personnel will be informed prior to landing." He clipped the radio back to his belt with mechanical precision, then finally turned to the rest of the cabin. Not to explain, but to confirm what they had all just witnessed. His eyes scanned the seats like a quiet reckoning. No one needed a speech. The message had already landed. Karen stood motionless, blinking, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her face had gone pale. Flushed moments ago with fury, it now drained of color as if reality had pulled the blood straight from her veins. Her hands, once firm and decisive, trembled slightly as she reached for the lanyard hanging around her neck. Slowly, almost ritualistically, she unclipped the ID badge, fingers fumbling once, then twice before finally removing it. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze remained downward, locked on the floor like it held the last ounce of her dignity. One step backward, then another. The sound of her heels, once sharp and confident, now felt hollow, like echoes in an empty hallway no one wanted to walk down. She turned without a word and made her way toward the rear of the cabin. No apology, no final retort. Just the slow, awkward retreat of someone who had built their power on perception and lost it all in a single breath. As she passed, the passengers said nothing, but they didn't look away. They tracked her movements with quiet intensity, every shoulder stiff, every expression taut. In the row behind Jasmine, a man leaned forward and muttered under his breath, "She's lucky that didn't go further." Another nodded silently. There was no applause, no outrage, only stillness, cold and final. Jasmine remained in seat 2A, body upright, eyes steady. She hadn't moved since the moment Morales had stepped in, but something about her posture had changed. Not tense, not triumphant, just rooted, like a woman who had spent her entire life being told to shrink, yet never once forgot how to stand. The crucifix rested quietly against her blouse, undisturbed. Its silver edges caught a shard of overhead light as the plane continued its steady ascent through open sky. The weight of the moment lingered long after Karen disappeared behind the curtain. It sat in the air, invisible but undeniable, like the scent of something burnt. People returned to their seats and their screens, but not to normal. There was no normal anymore. Not in that cabin. Not after what they had just seen. And deep down, every one of them knew it, because they hadn't just watched a confrontation. They had watched something be exposed, something many had suspected, some had lived, and too few had been brave enough to name. In the aisle, Captain Morales took one last look at Jasmine. He gave her the slightest nod. Respect, recognition, a silent confirmation that she hadn't imagined any of it, and that she had never been alone. Then he turned back toward the cockpit, his shoulders firm, his walk measured. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, and the silence he left behind was louder than any voice. As the curtain fell shut behind Karen and the final echo of the cockpit door faded, the cabin didn't return to its routines. Instead, it fell into the kind of stillness that only follows truth laid bare. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't exhale in triumph, didn't scan the room to see who had watched, who had judged, or who now sat in quiet awe. She simply remained still, anchored not by defiance, but by something deeper, something earned. Her hands rested softly on the armrests, her shoulders calm, her gaze forward. And around her neck, the crucifix, once challenged, nearly torn away, remained in place. It didn't glint, it didn't shine. It just was, steady, familiar, real. The cabin lights hummed low above her, casting a subtle glow on the silver cross that now seemed to carry the weight of everything unspoken in that room. Rows behind her, a child leaned gently into his father's side. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. His feet barely touched the floor, sneakers swinging slightly as he whispered, "She looks like Mom." The father didn't respond with words. He just placed a steady hand on the boy's back and looked toward Jasmine, eyes softening. It wasn't about resemblance. It was about recognition. The boy had seen strength before. Not the loud kind, the steady kind, the kind that endures. It started with a single clap. A woman seated across the aisle, older, dignified, dressed in a pale gray blazer, brought her hands together once. Not loud, not performative, just honest. The kind of clap not meant to start a movement, but to mark a moment. Then a second pair of hands joined, then another and another. It wasn't a standing ovation. No one rose, no one whooped. There were no cheers, only hands meeting hands in a slow, steady rhythm. Soft applause, gentle, weighted with something more than admiration, acknowledgement. The cabin had no music, but it felt like a scene scored with silence and pulse. Even the flight attendants at the rear, those not involved, stood motionless. The younger one, Nicole, had tears forming in the corners of her eyes, though she didn't blink them away. A man in business class, previously absorbed in spreadsheets and a second bourbon, now looked down at his folded hands as if suddenly unsure what work had ever really meant. And somewhere near the front, someone whispered, "This flight just became something else." Jasmine finally blinked, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she allowed herself to feel it now. The quiet shift, the emotional altitude change that came not from engines, but from exposure. And yet, there was no anger in her eyes, no vengeance, just gravity. Her crucifix still sat gently atop her chest, catching none of the light but all of the attention. It no longer looked like jewelry. It looked like testimony. Across the aisle, a passenger who had said nothing, all flight now sat straighter, hands folded in front of her mouth, whispering something silently. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name. A man 2 seats back lowered his phone. Video stopped, but the weight of the footage still pressing into his hands. He didn't need to post it. Not yet. Some things needed time to settle. Jasmine's breath came slow, deliberate, and the longer she sat, the more it became clear. She didn't have to say anything to win. She already had. Not in volume, not in power, in presence, in refusal. In truth, that didn't flinch when cornered. That kind of courage doesn't demand applause, but it earns something more rare. Respect that lingers long after the noise fades. The clapping slowed. It never swelled. It never became a moment of unity or spectacle. It simply existed. Brief, respectful, powerful. And then it faded, leaving behind a silence so full it felt like a second atmosphere. Jasmine looked out the window now, not to escape the room, but to take it in. Below them, the clouds rolled past like soft reminders of distance, of what had been overcome and what still lay ahead. No one dared speak first. Even conversations that tried to resume did so quietly, cautiously, as though the cabin had become sacred space, and no one wanted to shatter the stillness too soon. It was more than fear of being disrespectful. It was the instinct that everyone had just witnessed something larger than policy, larger than flying, larger than conflict. It was a reminder that freedom of belief isn't a courtesy, it's a right. And when someone tries to strip it away, not with violence, but with silence, with tone, with control, the resistance must be unshakable. Jasmine hadn't stood. She hadn't raised her voice. But in staying seated, she had drawn a line that split the room, not by race or politics, not even by belief, but by who saw her humanity and who tried to edit it. A mother across the aisle wiped her eyes and reached over to her daughter, maybe 5 years old. The child looked up and asked, "Why was everyone clapping?" The mother hesitated. "Because someone told the truth," she finally answered, "and the rest of us just listened." Simple, honest, enough. Back in seat 2A, Jasmine closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in rest. The kind that comes not when a battle ends, but when you know you didn't back down. Her hand moved slightly, fingertips brushing the cross gently, like a quiet nod to the parts of her no one had seen, but everyone had just felt. Outside the aircraft, the sky deepened into twilight. Inside, nothing looked different, but everything had changed. The applause had faded, the cabin had stilled, and as the plane began its slow descent through soft layers of cloud, Jasmine unbuckled her seatbelt, not to leave the moment behind, but to walk straight into the part no one ever sees. What comes after the storm? She moved quietly through the aisle, not drawing attention, not demanding it. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane prepared for landing, but her steps were slow, steady, almost reverent. Passengers turned their heads slightly as she passed, not to stare, but to acknowledge. There was no fear in their eyes now, no discomfort, only something quieter, deeper. Respect. She reached the curtain near the galley at the back of the plane, the one that separated crew space from passenger space, not by walls, but by custom, hierarchy, and habit. For a moment she paused, not because she doubted herself, but because what she was about to do required a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't fight back, but reaches forward. She pulled the curtain aside. There, slouched on a steel-backed crew seat next to the beverage cart, was Karen. Her uniform was still buttoned, but the crew badge that once dangled from her chest was gone. Stripped. Her name no longer authorized anything. Her posture was crumpled, like the weight of everything she'd tried to control had finally collapsed on her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed, mascara clinging in streaks to the edges of her lashes. She didn't hear Jasmine at first, too lost in the tremble of her own breath, the way her hands gripped a paper towel like it might hold her together. Then she looked up. And for a second, just a second, Karen looked like a different person. Not the woman who had tried to pull a crucifix off another's neck. Not the steward of policy, but someone small, someone undone. Someone who had just watched her own reflection in 1,000 silent stares and couldn't look away anymore. She didn't speak. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Maybe she expected Jasmine to confront her. Maybe she expected more silence. Maybe she expected nothing. What she didn't expect was what came next. Jasmine reached up, fingers brushing the silver chain at her collarbone. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. The clasp clicked softly and the crucifix fell into her palm. She held it there for a moment, eyes steady, heart open, the weight of the moment pressing down like the cabin's ceiling had lowered. Then gently she extended her hand and placed the cross in Karen's. Karen stared at it like it was on fire. Her fingers trembled, not because of the object itself, but because of what it meant. You're forgiven, not excused, not justified. Forgiven. Jasmine's voice was low, steady. I forgive you, she said, because none of us are born knowing how not to hurt other people. She didn't embellish. She didn't preach. She didn't soften the truth or lace it with sympathy. She just told it like it was. And that somehow made it hit even harder. Karen's lips parted again, but whatever words had formed died in her throat. Her eyes dropped to the crucifix in her hand. It was warm, still holding the heat of someone who had worn it not just through this flight, but through decades of battles that didn't make headlines. Her other hand flew to her mouth. A sound escaped, a sharp inhale, broken and wet. And then, like the pressure valve finally gave out, Karen collapsed into sobs. Not polite crying, not restrained. She wept, shoulders shaking, breaths ragged, eyes overflowing with something that had nothing to do with being embarrassed and everything to do with finally seeing herself. For the first time, she wasn't the one speaking. She wasn't in control, and she didn't want to be. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She simply stayed there, standing in the cramped galley of a descending aircraft, watching the woman who had tried to humiliate her break apart in the only honest way she ever had. She didn't touch her. She didn't say another word. She just let her fall apart, because sometimes grace doesn't pick you up. It lets you feel the full weight first. Around them, the cabin settled into final approach. Seat backs were raised, belts clicked. The voice over the intercom reminded passengers of landing procedures. But in that small corner of the plane, behind a thin curtain, something else was landing too. A woman's pride, her regret, her mask. And beside her stood another woman, unmoved, unshaken, and for the first time completely seen, not by cameras or clapping passengers, but by the very person who had tried to erase her. And in that, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win. She healed, she humanized, she rose, quietly, powerfully, completely. The plane touched down in silence, but what had taken flight inside that cabin didn't end on the runway. Instead, it detonated in a place far more explosive, the public eye. By the time Flight 218 taxied to the gate, the footage had already left the plane. A 47-second clip posted from seat 3B hit Twitter before the aircraft even powered down. Within an hour, it was trending. By the next morning, it was on every major outlet: CNN, MSNBC, BBC, even the bottom scroll of ESPN during halftime. The headlines varied in wording, but not in message. Flight attendant tries to rip cross off Congresswoman midair. Jasmine Crockett stands her ground at 38,000 feet. When silence becomes strength. The video showed no screaming, no violence, just the raw tension of injustice attempting to disguise itself as procedure. And Jasmine, seated, composed, calm, became an icon not because she shouted, but because she didn't have to. Karen's face was visible, clearly. The video caught every shift in her expression, every glance, every word, especially the moment her hand reached forward and the captain's voice slammed through the scene like a gavel in a courtroom. Comment sections exploded. Some viewers were stunned by her audacity. Others were devastated by how familiar it all felt. Hashtags formed like wildfire. Euroshark Crucifix Cabin, We're Flight 218, Euroshark Istan with Jasmine. Op-eds were written, panel discussions aired. One late-night host said, "She didn't just hold the line, She drew a new one, and through it all, Karen said nothing. No statement, no press release, no interviews, no attempts to reframe what had already been burned into the eyes of millions. Her name was everywhere, but her voice was nowhere. For 2 weeks, she disappeared from public life. No updates, no sightings. Her social media accounts went dark. And in the digital vacuum where most people rush to defend themselves, Karen did the one thing no one expected. She listened. Then quietly, without fanfare, without PR handlers, without makeup, she returned. It was a Sunday morning. The world had mostly moved on. New scandals, new outrage cycles. But at 7:12 a.m., a single video appeared on a newly opened YouTube channel titled only Karen Unedited. No music, no intro. Just a frame. A woman sitting in a modest kitchen, hair pulled back, eyes swollen from the kind of crying you don't do for cameras. She wore a simple gray t-shirt. Behind her, nothing staged, just a coffee maker, a fridge, and a crucifix resting gently on the table in front of her. Not worn, just present. She looked into the lens, not like someone performing, like someone confessing. "I lost my job," she began. Her voice was soft but not weak. "And at first I thought I lost everything. But I didn't. I gained something bigger. I learned how dangerous it is to live on autopilot, to let fear pretend to be professionalism. I learned that bias doesn't always shout, it whispers. And I listened to mine for too long." She paused, took a breath. "I saw that video too. Every frame, every comment. And I didn't post this to ask for sympathy. I posted it because people need to see what it looks like when someone realizes they were the problem." Her eyes dropped for a second, staring at the crucifix. "I don't deserve to wear this, not yet. But someone gave it to me anyway. She didn't do it to humiliate me. She did it because she saw me, really saw me, even when I couldn't see myself." And then came the sentence that broke the world's silence again. "I lost a job, but I found the part of myself that refuses to let prejudice make decisions for me ever again." She didn't cry in the video, not once. But when it ended, just a click to black, the world wept for her. Not because she had been a villain, but because, for the first time, she showed what redemption could look like when it's honest, unpolished, and painful. Within hours, the video spread. Tens of thousands of shares, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. Not just because of what she said, but because she didn't try to make herself the victim. In a culture trained to clap for empty apologies, Karen didn't offer one. She offered truth, the raw kind. The kind people recognize when they've had to admit the worst things about themselves in private and suddenly see someone else do it in public. Media outlets picked it up again, but this time, the tone was different. Former flight attendant breaks silence with humility and courage. Reddit threads that had once flamed her now pinned her video at the top. Not to erase what happened, but to show how people can face it. Instagram accounts that usually posted makeup tutorials shared her monologue with captions like, "This is the kind of reflection we need more of." But the real shift didn't happen online. It happened in classrooms where teachers played her words during discussions on bias, in HR departments that added her clip to their training programs, in churches where pastors referenced not just Jasmine's restraint, but Karen's reckoning. Her story became something larger than the flight. It became a reminder. Silence isn't always weakness, and confession isn't always collapse. Jasmine never responded publicly to the video. She didn't need to. The crucifix was enough. It had already done its work. Not just on Karen, but on millions who now saw it not as a piece of jewelry, but as a symbol of endurance, of restraint, and most of all, of unshakable grace under fire. And in the end, the world didn't remember Karen for what she tried to take. They remembered her for what she chose to give back. Her silence, her honesty, her surrender. Not in defeat, but in truth. And somehow that truth spoke louder than all the applause. The video had long stopped trending. The headlines had shifted elsewhere, to a celebrity scandal, a congressional hearing, a violent protest in another part of the world. But beneath the noise of the daily cycle, something deeper was happening. Quietly, gradually. and with the weight of something that wouldn't simply fade. It began where it always begins when systems are shaken, behind closed doors. In a high-rise office overlooking JFK Airport, a senior HR executive for a major airline replayed the footage one more time, alone in the dark with her tablet and a glass of untouched water. She didn't pause it at the viral moment, not when Karen reached for the crucifix, not when Captain Morales stormed out of the cockpit. She watched Jasmine, watched her body stay still, watched her words carve silence like scripture. Watched the crucifix, small, unpolished, still. Then she opened a blank memo and began typing. The next day, a proposal circulated among airline leadership teams under the subject line, bias under altitude, immediate staff culture, reevaluation. Within 72 hours, 3 airlines called emergency internal sessions. One launched a review of all existing customer neutrality policies. Another quietly reached out to Jasmine's office, asking if she would be willing to consult on inclusion training. She declined, not because she was bitter, but because she understood something they hadn't yet. You can't fix a system with a 1-hour seminar and catered sandwiches, but the message had landed, and it didn't land alone. At the FAA's Washington headquarters, 3 middle-aged men in matching ties reviewed the same footage in a boardroom that hadn't seen emotion in years. One of them, a former pilot, pressed pause after Jasmine's now iconic line. "It's not what's on my chest. It's what's in your eyes." He leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling and said, "Gentlemen, this is our moment. If we let it pass, we've lost more than reputation." 2 weeks later, a draft proposal was pushed through internal clearance. Mandatory quarterly bias awareness and de-escalation training for all in-flight staff. Not annual, not optional, and not just lip service. It would include behavioral case studies, footage review, trauma-informed response protocol, and, most importantly, anonymous passenger testimony from previous incidents never reported to the media. At first, unions pushed back. Then something changed, because stories started pouring in, from attendants who had been told by managers to be more presentable because of their accent, from Asian pilots who had been assumed to be foreign contractors, from Black passengers who had been asked again and again if they were in the right seat. The Crockett incident had done more than go viral. It had exposed a hairline fracture in the industry that ran much deeper than Karen's outburst. Jasmine hadn't just resisted a single injustice. She had revealed a blueprint for how bias hides in uniforms, smiles, and airline scripts, and people were finally ready to talk about it. What followed wasn't a revolution. It was something slower, heavier, more lasting, a shift in language. Policy manuals were rewritten, swapping maintained decorum with respect identity. Professional distance became culturally conscious presence, a shift in onboarding. Recruits no longer watch polished videos with stock actors. They watch footage from Flight 218. Real footage. Real mistakes. Real consequences. A shift in leadership. At least 5 senior training officers in national carriers quietly stepped down, not in shame, but in acknowledgement that they were no longer equipped to shape the culture they had once upheld. "I trained Karen," one man admitted in a resignation letter that was never leaked, "but I never taught her to see people." And beneath all of it, beneath the meetings, the policy changes, the quiet retirements, was a single question that no one could shake anymore. If Jasmine Crockett hadn't been famous, would anyone have believed her? It haunted people, in crew lounges, in offices, in the minds of executives staring into mirrors, because the answer was obvious, and that answer was unacceptable. So the change deepened. Colleges with aviation programs began integrating social psychology into their curricula. Mock training simulations included cross-racial and cross-cultural role plays. A psychology professor at New York University released a research paper titled "Altitude Bias, Power Perception, and the Flight Attendant Effect," using the Crockett confrontation as a central case study. But the most remarkable moment came not from a boardroom or a university. It came from a crew meeting in Denver. 35 flight attendants, most of them veterans, some of them new, sat in folding chairs on a rainy Wednesday morning, watching the video once more. No lights, no notes, just the clip. When it ended, the room was silent. Then one woman, tall, late 50s, uniform wrinkled from a red eye, stood up. She looked at the screen, then at the others. "I've been flying for 23 years," she said, "and I've seen this happen. I've let this happen. Maybe not this exact thing, but the stares, the corrections, the smiles that say, 'You don't belong here.' I've done it, not with words, with silence. And I think it's time we stop pretending it's just bad apples." No one clapped. No one cried. But something broke. Something heavy and necessary. That same woman would later lead a task force on inclusive in-flight language. Her first act? Retire the phrase premium guest expectation. Replace it with every guest, every right. In less than 6 weeks, an incident that had started with one crucifix and one quiet voice in seat 2A had ignited change across an industry known for resisting it. Jasmine hadn't attended a single meeting, hadn't issued a single demand. She didn't have to. Her restraint had done the talking. Her silence had spoken louder than any policy memo ever could. And the crucifix, it became more than a symbol. It became a case study, a quiet artifact of an ugly moment that turned into a national reckoning. Airlines began including its image, not for branding, but for memory. A reminder, a small silver cross, once almost ripped away, now printed discreetly on the inside covers of some crew training booklets with a single line beneath it. "See the human, not the threat." Not everyone agreed with the changes. There were protests, think pieces, calls for balance. But the shift didn't wait for unanimous approval. It was already happening, not through hashtags or outrage, but in small moments, behind curtains, in whispered apologies, in policy rewrites that no one tweeted about but quietly reshaped how people were treated in midair. And somewhere in all of this, Jasmine Crockett was not on stage, not online, not interviewed. She was walking through her community, talking to students, holding hands at voter registration tables, listening to elders who didn't care how many clicks her story had, only what she chose to do next. Because she understood something the world was just starting to learn. Real power doesn't scream. It sits still, holds its line, and changes everything. They came for her within days of the landing. News producers, political consultants, publicists with tailored suits and even tighter pitches. The offers were polished, professional, persuasive. "America needs you right now. You're the voice this country's been waiting for. This could be your moment, your Senate seat, your book deal, your televised platform." They didn't even pretend to hide the strategy. One woman from a major media network laid it out plain. "You don't need to change anything about who you are. You just need to step into the spotlight and let us shape the narrative around you." Jasmine Crockett sat through the meetings. She listened. She took the calls. Not because she was flattered, but because she wanted to hear the language of the machine. She wanted to understand how quickly people could take a moment born from trauma and spin it into traction. In one proposal meeting in downtown D.C., a senior campaign advisor held up a printout of a poll showing a 78% approval rating tied to her name. "You're gold," he said. "Black voters know you. White moderates respect you. You're what we call bulletproof optics. Authentic, articulate, and proven under pressure." Jasmine looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, voice even, unblinking. "Is that what I am to you? Optics?" The room went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that follows the sound of ego stepping on a landmine. He stammered. "That's not... I just meant, your moment is now. If you want it, we can build a run that turns you into more than a representative. We're talking national, Senate, or higher." That's when she stood up. Not abruptly, not in anger, just with the same steady grace she'd shown at 38,000 feet. She gathered her bag, buttoned her coat, then turned back toward the table of strategists, speechwriters, and image shapers who were still processing the shift in the room. "Let me be clear," she said. "This story was never about me winning anything. It was about a system that thought it could take something from me, and I'd sit there quietly. It was about power, yes, but not the kind you vote for, the kind that shows up in uniforms and tone of voice and phrases like, Can you please tuck that away? They didn't interrupt. They wouldn't dare. I'm not here for optics. I'm not a moment to capitalize on. I'm a woman who was almost stripped of her humanity at cruising altitude, and I responded the only way I knew how, by refusing to shrink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Tell your people this, she said as she walked to the door. I'm not running, not for office, not from confrontation, and definitely not toward anyone who sees me as a brand before they see me as a person. And with that, she left. The media didn't know what to do with her silence. Outlets that had built careers out of narratives waited. They speculated. They filled hours of airtime with guest panels and scrolling B-roll footage of Jasmine walking through airports, Jasmine in committee hearings, Jasmine looking out windows. But she gave them nothing. No interviews, no statements, no photo ops. For 2 weeks, they kept her name on the lower thirds. Crockett's next move? Is she the future of the party? What Jasmine isn't saying. And then they moved on. But the public didn't. Letters poured into her district office. Handwritten, folded, sometimes misspelled, but all of them carrying something raw. Hope. From teachers, from janitors, from young girls who had never seen someone like them hold the line so calmly, so fiercely. From older men who admitted, in shaky cursive, that they hadn't understood what privilege meant until they watched that video and felt their stomachs drop. One came from a retired colonel in Ohio. It was just one sentence. You reminded me of who I thought I was fighting for. She responded to everyone, sometimes with a phone call, sometimes with a letter. Always with something real. Her staff grew nervous. One aide, loyal and wide-eyed, finally asked, "Are you sure you want to stay quiet? They're saying you're missing your shot." Jasmine looked up from her stack of constituent letters and said simply, "Whose shot?" The aide blinked. "Yours, to rise." She leaned back in her chair, tired but not small. "Let me tell you something about power," she said. "It doesn't live on a podium. It doesn't grow in polling data. Real power doesn't ask for permission, and it damn sure doesn't come when you chase the moment. It comes when you outlast it." The aide didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Weeks later, she stepped in front of a classroom in a small public high school in Missouri. No cameras, no media, just a whiteboard, rows of desks, and students who had seen her face more on YouTube than in textbooks. She didn't lecture. She didn't retell the flight. Instead, she opened with a question. What would you have done if someone reached for something that mattered to you and tried to take it away? Silence, then answers. Slow, honest, some angry, some scared, all of them real. And when the class was over, a young girl in the front row stayed behind. She looked maybe 15, thin braids, nervous hands. Jasmine leaned down, gave her time. The girl finally whispered, "You didn't yell." "I think I would have yelled." Jasmine smiled. "There's nothing wrong with yelling," she said. "But there's also nothing wrong with choosing silence, if that silence is stronger than their noise." The girl nodded slowly. "Is that why you didn't run? For office, I mean." Jasmine paused, then knelt down so their eyes were level. "I didn't run," she said, "because they wanted me to perform my strength. I wanted to live it." And live it she did. She returned to her district, sat in community meetings, fought quiet legal battles no one broadcasted, pushed for policy changes in places that didn't come with applause. She spent Sundays in old churches where the air was thick with incense and memory, where elders called her child and asked if she was eating enough. She stayed visible, but not performative. She stayed present, but not political. She stayed powerful, but never loud. And so the world watched and waited. And slowly people began to understand. Jasmine Crockett didn't need a campaign to rise. She had already won the one fight most never even enter. The fight to remain fully human in a world that's built to forget you are. The sky above Atlanta was the color of brushed steel. Quiet, overcast, unremarkable. Inside Gate C-27, passengers lined up with boarding passes and earbuds, dragging carry-ons with frayed wheels and TSA anxious glances. It was a typical Tuesday. There were no reporters, no flashing cameras, no trending hashtags. But tucked into row 18, seat A, sat a girl who had seen everything. She was 11, brown-skinned, hair parted neatly and woven into small braids, tight and symmetrical, still shiny with the sheen of coconut oil applied that morning by a grandmother with careful hands. Her hoodie was blue, oversized, sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her sneakers were white, mostly. On her lap sat a paperback copy of Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, dog-eared, pages curling at the corners. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. She just watched the aisle quietly as passengers trickled in, one by one, like chess pieces being placed before the game began. Around her neck, mostly tucked beneath her hoodie, was a small silver crucifix. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't decorative. It was simple, unpolished, slightly worn. The kind you wear not for show, but for memory. Her fingers reached up to touch it every so often, like someone checking that a secret was still there. A few rows up, a toddler cried. Flight attendants smiled as they lifted suitcases overhead. The woman next to her, a tech consultant on a laptop, barely noticed the girl existed. But the girl didn't need to be seen. Not by her, because she had seen Jasmine. Weeks earlier, she'd been curled on her grandmother's couch in Memphis, one sock off, knees to chest, watching the footage from Flight 218 on an iPad screen that shook every time her grandma clicked play again. At first, she hadn't understood. It was just a quiet woman, sitting in a plane seat, not yelling, not crying, just there, calm, still, not moving, even as the woman in uniform tried to take her necklace away. Her grandma had whispered under her breath, "Hold the line, baby," as if she knew what came next. And when Jasmine finally said it, "It's not what's on my chest, it's what's in your eyes." The girl felt something snap into place inside her. Not a cheer, not a jolt, just clarity. Because she knew that feeling. The one where someone looks at you and sees a question mark before they ever see a human. The one where your name is mispronounced, where your hoodie is too casual, your tone too sharp, your presence always a little too much for a space that claims to be neutral. And Jasmine hadn't begged. She hadn't explained. She hadn't asked for permission. She just sat there and refused to disappear. That was the moment the girl in row 18 decided she would never take her cross off again. Not for school dress codes, not for play auditions. Not even when her mother warned gently, "Some people may not understand, sweetheart." She didn't care, because she had seen what it meant to carry something holy, and not flinch when the world demanded you tuck it away. As the plane taxied, the girl pressed her forehead lightly to the window, watching the airport blur by in soft streaks of gray and white. She imagined what it must have felt like to be Jasmine in that seat. Seat 2A, so close to the front, so far from safety. To be still when someone's hand reached for your truth and tried to take it. A voice startled her. Software real. "Would you like something to drink, sweetheart?" She looked up. The flight attendant wasn't Karen. She wasn't Jasmine either. She was young, maybe late 20s. Nervous smile, name tag crooked, her ponytail slightly undone from a rushed day. But her eyes were kind, not performatively so, just tired and kind, like someone trying harder than she let on. The girl nodded. "Ginger ale, please." The attendant poured it slowly, quietly, and handed it to her with a napkin that had a cartoon airplane printed on it. Then, as she was about to move on, the girl asked, "Do you know who Jasmine Crockett is?" The question hung there, innocent, dangerous, sacred. The attendant blinked. A beat passed, then another. "Yes," she said finally. Her voice softened. "Yes, I do." No follow-up, no explanation. Just a small smile, a real one this time, before she moved on down the aisle. The girl took a sip of her ginger ale. It tasted sharp and sweet. She closed her book, pulled the cross from under her hoodie, and let it rest on her chest. And she leaned back into her seat, not with arrogance, but with peace. She didn't know it yet, but someone 3 rows behind had noticed. A middle-aged black man, professor of literature. He'd been watching quietly, recognizing the way her fingers touched the crucifix the same way his mother used to touch hers. He smiled. Legacy, he thought, doesn't always come with loud footsteps. Sometimes it walks in worn sneakers and carries a paperback book. At 30,000 feet, turbulence rocked the cabin briefly. Seatbelts clicked, heads lifted. But the girl didn't flinch. She reached up and held her cross, just as she had seen Jasmine do in the video. Calm, present, not asking to be invisible. And for a moment, just a moment, the plane wasn't flying through clouds. It was flying through something bigger, through memory, through resilience, through legacy carried not by speeches, but by one child deciding she would not be erased. Not on this flight, not in this life, not ever. Later, as passengers filed out, the girl waited patiently. She let the crowd thin. She thanked the flight attendant with a quiet nod. Then, just before stepping through the cabin door, she glanced left towards seat 2A. It was empty, but not forgotten. She looked at it for a second longer than she needed to, then walked on, cross swinging gently against her chest. Not for show, for history. As the airport doors slid open and the girl stepped into the world beyond the runway, one thing had become clear. This was never just about a flight. It was about everything we carry and everything they try to take. There are stories we forget before the plane lands, and then there are stories that follow us home, etched into our conscience like turbulence that lingers long after the skies clear. Jasmine Crockett's quiet defiance wasn't just an isolated act of courage. It was a line drawn in the invisible war millions fight daily, the war to exist without apology. In a world where injustice often wears a smile and speaks in soft policy language, her stillness was a rebellion. She showed us that dignity doesn't need permission, that belief isn't something to be tucked away for the comfort of others, and she proved, beyond words, that grace under fire is not weakness. It is the greatest form of resistance. What happened on that flight wasn't loud. It wasn't violent, but it was devastating, because it exposed how deeply systems will go to strip you of your symbols, your story, yourself, and how powerful it is when someone refuses to shrink. But this story didn't end with a confrontation. It planted something. In classrooms, in corporate meetings, in the silent thoughts of strangers who suddenly recognized their own prejudice in Karen's hand. Jasmine's response reminded us that the people most often asked to stay quiet are usually the ones with the most powerful truths. She taught us that being professional should never mean being invisible, that silence, when chosen, can roar, that humanity doesn't begin at the boarding gate, and it sure as hell doesn't end with a name badge and a smile. Her strength forced a question we must all answer. When faced with quiet injustice, will we freeze or will we hold the line? Because the real flight wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about changing altitude in how we see, how we act, and how we choose to carry the stories that matter. And from that day forward, in every seat occupied by someone who dares to be fully seen, her legacy flies on, quiet, unbending, unshakable. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In just one live broadcast, Jasmine Crockett turned the insult race baiter into a national rallying cry and forced millions to rethink everything they thought they knew. On that stage, Tomi Lahren tried to shame her, but instead exposed a wound far deeper than politics. The confrontation shattered 30 years of silence inside the most powerful conference for women of color. This wasn't just a debate. It was a battle over who gets to tell the truth in America. What did Jasmine Crockett say that shook the nation and left even her biggest critics speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the hard glow of primetime lights, America Unfiltered, Live Debate Special, began not with polite exchange, but with the silence before an ambush. Broadcast live on Fox and C-SPAN, the event was advertised as a democratic dialogue. But the set told a different story. Tomi Lahren sat poised, her expression calm, almost bored. She wasn't here to ask questions. She came armed with answers. Known for her firebrand monologues and disdain for progressive causes, she believed truth was absolute and that racial politics had become a tool of guilt. To her, white Americans were being forced to carry a burden they didn't create. Jasmine Crockett, in her view, was not a reformer, but a symbol of that manipulation, a race baiter cloaked in legalese. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, shoulders squared, suit sharp, eyes locked. A congresswoman and civil rights attorney, she carried more than policy. She carried scars, some hers, many inherited. She didn't believe in both sides. She believed in the side that bled. For her, justice wasn't abstract. It had a cost, and it was overdue. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to break silence with truth. The room hadn't exploded yet, but something colder had, the quiet certainty that this wouldn't be a conversation, it would be a reckoning. The host, a seasoned broadcaster with the polished calm of someone trained to survive controversy, leaned slightly forward and smiled into the camera. "Let's start simple," he said, feigning neutrality. "Has America become too sensitive when it comes to race?" It was bait, soft, ambiguous, designed to sound harmless. But everyone on that stage knew it was a tripwire. The lights flared up. The red camera tally lit. Jasmine and Tommy both turned toward their microphones, with the tension of two chess masters about to make the first irreversible move. Jasmine waited. Tommy didn't. Tommy leaned in, her voice laced with sweet venom, not shouting. Worse, she was calm. "You're not fighting for justice, Jasmine," she said, eyes locked, smile practiced. "You're just another race baiter selling division for votes." The words weren't loud, but they struck like a fist through glass. There were no gasps from the audience, no dramatic music cue, just a silence sharp enough to cut. The term hung in the air like a slur disguised as strategy, calculated, direct, brutal. It wasn't an argument. It was a dismissal dressed as truth, and Tommy knew exactly what she was doing. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for rebuttal. She simply looked at Tommy, not with rage, but with something colder, something older. Her head tilted slightly, not in confusion, but in preparation. She lowered her gaze for just a second, not in shame, but like a surgeon glancing at the table before making the first incision. It wasn't silence born of being stunned. It was the silence of someone choosing exactly when and how to strike back. And in that moment, without saying a word, Jasmine Crockett seized the entire room. But Tommy wasn't finished. She saw the silence as a green light, not a warning, and pressed harder, her voice growing sharper even as her tone stayed maddeningly calm. She shifted her weight in the chair, almost casually, as if preparing to give a lecture instead of a fight. "I don't discriminate, Jasmine," she began, her voice low and deliberate. "I just tell the truth." She said it with the kind of practiced ease that made lies sound like common sense. "White Americans have problems too, struggles too, hurt too." She stretched the last word, hurt, just enough to plant the seed of false equivalence deep into the audience's mind. She paused, letting the silence serve her, watching the crowd like a performer timing their applause. No outrage, no gasps, just a heavy, waiting air, like the moment before a building collapses. Tommy's lips curled slightly, the barest ghost of a smirk as she went on. "The difference is, we don't wear our struggles like armor. We don't weaponize our pain." Her hand moved, a slow, dismissive flick, carving invisible lines through everything Jasmine stood for. "We don't make the country kneel for mistakes none of us committed." She leaned forward, just slightly, enough that her shadow stretched longer across the polished stage. "America is tired, Jasmine. Tired of being shamed for existing. Tired of bending under the weight of guilt it didn't earn." Her words weren't screamed. They were poured, thick and heavy, into the space between them. Every syllable seemed designed not to spark a fight, but to deny there had ever been one worth fighting. Across the studio, ripple reactions flickered like nervous sparks. Some audience members nodded reflexively, the way people do when they want permission to believe the easy thing. Others froze, visibly uncomfortable, their hands tightening on armrests, their bodies betraying an unease their faces tried to hide. It was working. Tommy's poison was subtle but effective. She wasn't debating anymore. She was massaging the lie into their bones. That injustice was a past tense. That demanding repair was the real crime. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her rhythm, she drove the knife in deeper. "You don't want equality, Jasmine," Tommy said, almost softly now, a confession dressed as a condemnation. "You want special treatment. You want privilege parading as justice." Her eyes stayed locked on Jasmine's, cold and unblinking, as if daring her to interrupt. "You want to split this country open along every scar line it ever healed? And call it progress." A few more nods now. The smile that played on Tommy's lips wasn't victorious. It was clinical, the detached smile of someone who believed, truly believed, that all they had to do was sound reasonable enough, and no one would see the wound they were deepening beneath the surface. But where Tommy expected outrage, expected another fire to smother with rehearsed contempt, Jasmine gave her something far more dangerous. Silence that chose its moment like a blade choosing where to strike. Jasmine didn't rush to fill the loaded air. She sat back for half a second, steady as stone, then leaned in toward the microphone with the calm precision of someone placing a final piece on a chessboard. Her eyes never left Tommy's face, never blinked, never wavered. "Equality is not privilege," she said, her voice low but unshakable, each word clean enough to carve marble. "Justice isn't about getting more. It's about lifting the weight that others have carried alone their entire lives." She paused there, not because she needed time, but because she wanted the truth to echo in the space Tommy thought she had conquered. For a heartbeat, the stage was frozen. No applause, no gasps, just the raw collision of two realities in the same breathless room. Jasmine shifted slightly forward, letting the gravity of her next words fall clean between them. "I'm not the one who brings race into everything," she said, voice sharper now, stripped of ceremony. "I live inside it. I have lived inside it since I was 8 years old." The spotlight above caught the sharp planes of her face, the set jaw, the eyes that refused to yield even an inch. There was no rage there, no wounded dramatics, only the unvarnished truth of someone who had carried history on her back for too long to be startled by someone else's denial. Jasmine turned her gaze from Tommy to the camera, slow and deliberate, speaking not just to the studio, but to everyone watching who had ever been told their pain was an inconvenience. "And if you think speaking the truth," she said, the words landing like hammer blows masked in velvet, "is what makes someone a race baiter, maybe the problem isn't the truth itself. Maybe it's that you've never had to live it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, thick, furious, and utterly hers. But Jasmine wasn't done just speaking truth. She was about to peel it back layer by brutal layer, forcing everyone, even Tommy, to see the cost of what they so easily dismissed. She shifted in her seat, not to adjust, but to anchor herself in a memory that had never really left. "When I was 8 years old," Jasmine began, her voice dropping to a tone that seemed almost too heavy for the microphone, "I learned what justice means when you have the wrong color skin." Her eyes didn't flicker. Her breathing didn't quicken. But the temperature in the room seemed to drop by degrees as she spoke, each word dragging everyone with her into a night that should have been nothing, but became everything. And for a second, the world forgot to breathe. "It was 10 o'clock at night," she said, her hands folding carefully together, as if shielding something fragile. "My father had just come home from work. He was exhausted. 2 shifts back to back at the mill, grease still under his nails, his uniform still smelling like sweat and iron." Her voice thickened, not with pity, but with the raw texture of remembrance. "He forgot to use his turn signal. That was it. That's all it took." Jasmine looked out over the audience now, daring them to look away. Nobody moved, not even the cameras. But he wasn't just a tired man driving home. To them, to the men in those police cruisers, he was a black man behind the wheel at night, and that was all they needed to see. By the time he pulled into our driveway, there were 6 police cars, lights flashing, sirens blaring, no questions, no warnings, just 6 white officers with guns drawn, screaming at my father like he had just robbed a bank. when all he had done was exist while black. She paused there, letting the image sear itself into the room. I remember standing on the porch, barefoot, my little sister clutching my legs so hard she left bruises. I remember the way my mother screamed his name, not like a wife calling a husband, but like a soldier calling for a fallen comrade she couldn't reach. Jasmine's hands shook slightly now, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. And somewhere, under the studio lights, the air grew heavier, like rain pressing on a broken roof. They didn't see a tired worker. They didn't see a father. They didn't see a man who built engines with his hands for a country that barely knew his name. They saw a threat because of his skin, and they moved like it was a battlefield and he was the enemy. Her voice dropped lower, so low the audience had to lean in to catch every word. And I remember, she said, blinking once, very slowly, one of them shouting, "Hands where I can see them, boy." The word boy landed in the studio like a gunshot, soft but deafening. Jasmine let it sit there, refusing to soften it, refusing to translate it into anything safer than what it was, the old rotting vocabulary of racial domination. I didn't understand then, she said, her voice cracking, not from weakness, but from the unbearable innocence she could never get back. I turned to my mother and asked, "Mama, why did they call Daddy boy? He's bigger than them." Her throat worked against a rising knot, but she forced the next sentence out clean, sharp, deliberate. And my mother just held me tighter. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I learned that night, in their eyes, he was never a man. He was black first, and in this country, sometimes that's all they ever see. The room was dead silent, the kind of silence that feels like standing at the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath you. Cameras zoomed in automatically, drawn like moths to the unbearable gravity Jasmine had unleashed. Tommy sat frozen, blinking rapidly now, her mouth tightening at the corners. Not with triumph, but with something far less stable. The carefully polished narrative she had built was buckling under the pressure of something she could neither explain away nor deny. Jasmine hadn't shouted. She hadn't pleaded. She had simply held up the truth, and it shattered the room far more violently than any scream ever could. The studio hadn't moved in minutes, but now Jasmine did. Not back, not down, but forward, turning the weight of her own story into a blade pointed at everything Tommy thought she understood. The calm in her voice was gone now, not replaced by rage, but by something colder, something heavier. It was the sound of someone done being polite. She didn't look at the camera this time. She looked straight into Tommy's eyes, and when she spoke, it wasn't to ask. It was to confront. "Have you," Jasmine began, her voice low and firm, "ever had to sit your child down and teach them how to survive a traffic stop?" Her tone didn't rise, but the words hit like a sudden drop in pressure. Not how to get out of a ticket, not how to talk to a cop. I mean, how to come home alive. She let that sit a moment. Have you ever had to tell your son to keep his hands on the wheel, not to move too fast, to call you if he gets pulled over, not because he did anything wrong, but because you're afraid of what the officer might see before he even speaks? She shifted her gaze now, not to retreat, but to widen the field of truth. Have you ever walked into your own apartment building, holding your groceries, and had someone ask what unit you're cleaning? There was no anger in her voice, only clarity. Have you ever had a neighbor look at you like you don't belong? Not because of what you're doing, but because of who they think you are? She drew a slow breath and pressed forward. Have you ever had something you wrote, a speech, a story, a truth, quietly taken off a program because someone said it felt too political, too racial, too much? Her words weren't stylized. They were lived in, raw, because I have, more than once, and every time they smiled and called it an editing decision. Jasmine's voice didn't tremble, but the tension in the room was electric, like the air before a lightning strike. And then she asked it again, not to Tommy, but to the nation. Have you ever had to shrink your truth just to make someone else comfortable? Tommy opened her mouth, but no words came. She pulled in a breath, shifted in her chair, reached for something, anything that might fit the moment. Nothing fit. Her eyes darted toward the moderator, then quickly away, as if even glancing for help made it worse. She looked down at her notes, but they were useless now. The air wasn't tense anymore. It was crushing. Jasmine had pulled the conversation out of politics and dragged it into a life Tommy had never touched, never had to survive. And there, in front of millions, Tommy's silence said more than any defense ever could. The room didn't move. The cameras didn't flinch. And for the first time all night, Tommy Loren wasn't leading the conversation. She was drowning in it. The silence that swallowed Tommy wasn't an ending. It was Jasmine's opening. And when she spoke again, it was with the precision of someone who had been waiting her whole life to say what couldn't be ignored anymore. She sat still for a moment, letting the tension settle, then leaned slightly forward, her hands folding carefully, her voice steady enough to cut steel. "Race baiter," she said, almost spitting the words out like they tasted rotten. She let them hang in the air for a second longer than needed, forcing everyone to feel the weight of them. "That's what they call us," she continued, her voice low, tight. "Not because we're lying, not because we're wrong, but because we dare to speak the truth out loud, and they don't want to hear it." Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was laying out evidence like a prosecutor building a case no jury could ignore. Every time we say, "This happened to me," they say we're stirring hate. Every time we say, "This hurts," they accuse us of playing victim. Every time we say, "This is wrong," they call it division. She drew in a breath, slow and even, as if daring the room to breathe with her. But when others, men waving Confederate flags, men beating police officers with their own batons, stormed the United States Capitol, they weren't called race baiters. They weren't even called terrorists. They were called misguided patriots. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The fury was in the facts. A crack ran through the room, then, not sound, but feeling, a ripple, deep and unstoppable. Somewhere near the back, a woman stood, hands trembling slightly, and started clapping. Another man, older, wearing a veteran's cap, rose beside her, his face tight with something caught between grief and pride. The applause wasn't loud at first. It wasn't choreographed or clean. It was messy, raw, the kind of applause that comes when people have been holding their breath for too long. Others followed, rising slowly, like the tide pulling against the shore. The moderator, face pale, waved frantically for them to sit, gesturing for calm, for order, but the control was gone. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't break her focus. She let the applause happen without reacting to it, because her goal had never been to be liked. It was to be heard. And tonight, finally, she was. But what erupted inside that studio wasn't the end of it. Outside those walls, across phones, laptops, living rooms, a storm had already started, and it wasn't one anyone could control. Within minutes after the cameras cut away, the world outside the studio caught fire. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of it lit up at once, a tidal wave of raw reaction that no network spin could contain. Screens across the country flickered with the same furious momentum. Clips of Jasmine leaning forward, speaking truths too sharp to ignore, racing across timelines faster than anchors could catch their breath. It wasn't just politicians or activists posting. It was teenagers, teachers, factory workers, soldiers, people who had been told for too long to sit quietly while others decided what was acceptable pain and what was too divisive to mention. The hashtags exploded into life like sparks on dry grass. First one, then a dozen, then thousands piling on at once, breaking the surface of the digital noise. Race baiter reclaimed hit trending first, a direct punch to the insult that Tommy had tried to use like a noose. It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a declaration. Black and brown users, activists, and even ordinary Americans posted images of themselves with their fists raised, their heads held high, reclaiming the label meant to silence them. Under every post, there was a message clear as a siren. "We're not baiting you, we're reminding you." Alongside it, numbered Jasmine Crockett. Truth climbed like a rocket, every post stitching a quilt of shared defiance and bitter memory. Videos clipped from the debate, especially the moment Jasmine said, "Maybe the problem isn't the truth, Maybe it's that you've never had to live it, looped endlessly, burning into the collective memory before the morning news could even pretend to frame it another way. It wasn't just adults responding. Across schools, colleges, and even middle schools, students flooded platforms like TikTok and Instagram stories with reactions sharp enough to pierce steel. One post from a high school sophomore in Chicago exploded overnight, racking up 2 million likes by itself. The caption was simple but lethal. Tommy Lahren made race baiter sound like a curse. Jasmine made it sound like armor. The words hit like a hymn in a country still struggling to understand the difference between discomfort and injustice. Beneath the post, comments poured in faster than the servers could refresh. Thousands of young voices, not shouting slogans, but sharing the small, brutal memories that Jasmine had cracked open. The sideways glances in stores, the extra police stops, the jobs lost after speaking up, the scholarships questioned because of skin color instead of merit. None of it was new. It had just finally been said, out loud in a place where everyone could hear it. On YouTube, the clip of Jasmine's takedown, especially the 3 minutes where Tommy tried and failed to answer, hit 12 million views in the first 6 hours alone. No edits, no commentary, just raw footage. No one needed flashy editing or dramatic background music to make it powerful. The silence said enough. Under the video, the comments stretched for miles, people writing things they had never dared say before. This wasn't just a win. This was survival. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She made them sit in what they've ignored. For once, we weren't asked to make it palatable. Meanwhile, mainstream media outlets scrambled to catch up, issuing hurried balance segments that only made them look slower, smaller. They played split screens trying to weigh both sides, but the internet had already decided. This wasn't about sides anymore. It was about lived reality versus denial. And denial was losing ground by the second. In private group chats, text threads, Zoom calls that night, the conversation boiled over. Families called each other. Friends texted friends. People who had never spoken openly about race before found themselves choking on the sudden flood of everything they had tried to tuck away to survive. Jasmine's voice had cracked something open, not just in the debate, but across the country. And what was spilling out now wasn't rage exactly. It was clarity, the kind that doesn't go back in the box once you see it. For every article trying to frame the debate as contentious, there were 10,000 voices on the ground calling it what it was: an exorcism, a naming, a reckoning long overdue. One viral tweet captured it best. Tonight wasn't a debate, it was a mirror. Some people just didn't like what they saw. Inside the networks, producers and executives whispered urgently about how to balance coverage, but outside, nobody waited for their permission to care. The story wasn't in the carefully framed recaps. It was alive, pulsing, carried in the fingertips of millions of people typing furiously into the night, refusing, just for once, to let the old narratives close over this moment like dirt over a grave. And somewhere, between the trending hashtags and the endless reposts, the undeniable truth spread faster than any news cycle could contain. Jasmine Crockett had turned a slur meant to silence her into armor for everyone who had ever been told to make their pain quieter. And the country, at least the part willing to listen, wasn't just watching. It was standing up. But as millions stood with her online, Jasmine sat alone in the dark. Because victory doesn't always feel like triumph when it costs pieces of your soul. The studio lights were long gone. The noise, the clapping, the chaos. It had all dissolved behind thick tinted windows. Jasmine sat in the driver's seat of her parked car, her blazer still stiff on her shoulders, her throat raw from restraint. The engine wasn't running. The only sound was the hum of the city at night. Distant sirens, wind brushing glass, the occasional passing car that didn't know what had just happened inside that building. Her hands rested on the wheel, fingers gripping it tighter than she realized. She stared ahead, not at anything, just into the stillness. Out there, she knew the world was on fire. Hashtags, praise, reaction videos. She could feel the echo of it even here. But in this quiet metal box, there was no camera, no crowd, no armor, just breath and silence. The phone buzzed in the center console, screen lighting up the shadows. "Mom." Jasmine hesitated for just a second, then answered. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her mother's voice came through the line with the kind of gentleness that could only come from surviving what others thought would break you. "I watched the whole thing," her mother said, voice steady but low, as if her pride came with an ache she couldn't quite name. There was a pause. Not hesitation, just wait. "They used to call me agitator, you know." Jasmine blinked, her grip tightening on the wheel. Her mother's voice was slower now, like someone sifting through memories she hadn't touched in a long time. "When I protested the school board in '68, they ripped the buttons off my shirt, poured water in my hair, told me I was the reason this country couldn't heal." Jasmine closed her eyes. The car felt smaller suddenly, warmer, heavier. Her mother wasn't raising her voice. She never had to. The pain she spoke of was laced into her tone like stitching in old fabric. "They said I was making things worse just for asking why my school books were 15 years older than theirs. They called it stirring up trouble. I called it surviving." Another pause. "I didn't win that day. They shut down the meeting. I lost my job 2 weeks later. But you," her voice caught now for the first time, "you didn't just speak tonight, Jasmine. You made them listen, all of them, even the ones who didn't want to." The words hit harder than any insult Jasmine had faced on that stage. She swallowed, jaw clenched, but her eyes burned anyway. She tried to breathe through it, but something inside cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the quiet, undeniable crack of someone finally being seen in a way they weren't prepared for. Her mother wasn't finished. "You took a word they used to shame us and made it a shield. You didn't ask for permission to speak. You didn't water it down. And that moment where she went silent?" Jasmine didn't reply. Her chest rose and fell slowly, like someone trying to stay calm in deep water. "That silence," her mother said, "was the loudest thing in the room." A tear slid down Jasmine's cheek, hot and slow. She didn't sob. She didn't shake. But her grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her face didn't crumple. She didn't break down. She just sat there, the weight of her mother's words pressing down like gravity. This wasn't applause. This wasn't Twitter. This wasn't a viral moment. This was her mother, the woman who had endured the world Jasmine had just challenged, telling her that she had done what her generation never got the chance to do, be heard without apology. Jasmine finally whispered, barely audible, "I didn't think it would land like that." Her mother chuckled softly, not unkindly. "It landed because it was real, and real doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be said." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Just the low hum of the car's electrical system, the quiet outside, and the echo of generations pressing against the present. Jasmine exhaled through her nose, eyes still closed, lips parted just slightly. Her mother's voice came again, softer now. "I'm proud of you, baby. But more than that, I see you, all the way. And I know how much it costs to hold that room without flinching." Jasmine nodded to no one. Her left hand slowly released the wheel, flexing her fingers like they had just come out of a fight. And in a way they had. Not a fight with fists, a fight with history, with silence, with expectation, with every time she had been told to calm down, to smile more, to not make it about race. Tonight she hadn't made it about race. The country had, and she just refused to lie about it. When the call ended, she didn't move right away. She sat in the quiet, one tear drying on her cheek, the other just beginning to fall. She didn't need to break down. She had already broken through, and now for the first time all night, she let her body relax, just slightly. Not in victory, not in relief, but in knowing she had survived being seen, not celebrated, not tolerated. Seen, for all of it. While Jasmine sat quietly in the dark, carrying the weight of battles fought for generations, Tommy stepped into a very different kind of darkness, one she had never expected and one she couldn't control. In the days that followed, the fallout came fast, brutal, and merciless. It didn't start with news anchors or press releases. It started with emails, with phone calls, with meetings she wasn't invited to anymore. First, one of Tommy's biggest sponsors, a national outdoor gear company, quietly pulled their contract, citing a need to reassess brand values. Then came the speaking engagements. Conferences that had once rolled out red carpets now sent vague, apologetic emails postponing her appearances until further notice. She tried to shrug it off at first, telling herself it was political correctness gone wild. But by the end of the week, it was impossible to ignore. When Tommy showed up at a business summit in Dallas, the protesters were waiting for her. Not dozens, hundreds. Veterans, teachers, high school students holding handmade signs that read, "Truth is not division, and pain is not politics." They didn't shout obscenities. They didn't throw things. They just stood there, silently, forcing everyone entering the venue to walk through a sea of faces that no slogan could erase. Tommy had walked through hostile crowds before. She had worn controversy like armor. But this was different. This wasn't about disagreement. It was about exposure. She had been caught standing on ground she no longer understood, speaking into wounds she had never bled from. And now the world wasn't clapping back. It was moving on without her. By the fourth day, her team, or what was left of it, begged her to release a statement. Something to reclaim the narrative. Tommy resisted. She had built her brand on never backing down, on never apologizing. But late one night, sitting alone in her apartment, the light from her phone casting long shadows across the floor, she realized something she didn't want to admit even to herself. Shouting louder wasn't going to fix this, because for the first time, people weren't arguing with her politics. They were questioning her humanity. She opened the front-facing camera, stared at her reflection for a long moment. No makeup, no filters, no carefully staged lighting, and hit record. The video she posted was only 3 minutes long, but it spread faster than anything she had ever scripted. Her voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. No bravado, no fire, just something raw she could no longer fake away. "I used to believe," Tommy began, staring into the lens like it might bite her, "that telling the truth meant saying what I thought without apology." She swallowed hard, the tiniest hitch in her voice betraying how much the words cost. "But maybe what I called truth was just my own fear, disguised as facts." She paused, and for a second it seemed like she might shut the video off. But she pressed forward, each word heavier than the last. "Maybe I wasn't standing up for anything. Maybe I was standing in the way of hearing someone else's pain. And maybe it's time I learned the difference." She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer easy redemption or tearful breakdowns. She just ended the video with 6 simple words, quiet but undeniable. "I need to learn. I will listen." There was no dramatic music, no sweeping message about healing, just a woman finally running out of places to hide. The reaction online was seismic, but not in the way Tommy was used to. Some of her old fans called it weakness, betrayal. They flooded her accounts with accusations. "You sold out. You caved to the mob. You're dead to us." But there was a different kind of response, too. One she hadn't expected. Quiet, thoughtful. Not all of it forgiving, but none of it mocking. Comments from people who weren't interested in dragging her, just reminding her that growth isn't supposed to be comfortable. One user wrote, "Listening is the first thing they teach you in kindergarten. Some of us just have to learn it later." Another simply said, "It's not about you anymore. It's about whether you're willing to stop making it about you." The video racked up millions of views within hours. But this time, Tommy didn't bask in the numbers. She didn't post follow-ups. She didn't double down. She just disappeared for a while, retreating into a silence that wasn't about defeat, but maybe for the first time in her career, about reflection. Meanwhile, sponsors continued to fall away, one by one, not out of spite, not even entirely out of anger, but because the ground had shifted beneath them too. They weren't pulling back because she was controversial. They were pulling back because she had become irrelevant to the conversation they could no longer afford to ignore. Inside her own circle, the rupture was brutal. Some advisors urged her to fight harder, to reclaim her voice, to double down on the old playbook of outrage and defiance. But Tommy, sitting alone with her phone, watching the replay of Jasmine Crockett, speaking not to win, but simply to be heard, understood something no PR spin could fix. The world wasn't asking her to be louder. It was asking her to be honest. Maybe for the first time. In the end, Tomi's video didn't redeem her. It didn't erase the harm or rewrite the past. And it didn't magically turn her into a hero. But it did something harder. It made her stop firing. Made her put down the weapons she had spent a career sharpening. Outrage, mockery, defensiveness. And face the empty space left behind when all the noise was gone. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't absolution. But it was the first crack in a wall she had spent her whole life building. And sometimes the first crack is enough to let something real start growing through. But sometimes the loudest transformations happen in places without cameras, without headlines, in quiet corners, where two people sit down not to perform, but simply to face the wreckage between them. The rain had started hours earlier, leaving a thin mist clinging to the sidewalks of D.C., blurring streetlights into halos. The cafe sat on a side street no tourist would stumble into by accident. Just old brick, scratched windows, and a hand-painted sign that had probably survived 3 generations. Inside, the hum of conversation was low, tired, like a city exhaling after too many long nights. No security detail, no producers, no publicists hovering with nervous eyes. Just 2 women sitting across a small battered wooden table, the space between them filled with the kind of silence that doesn't need explanation. Jasmine stirred her coffee once, twice, then let the spoon fall back into the saucer with a soft clink. She didn't touch the cup after that. She didn't smile. She didn't soften her eyes. She just sat there, letting the seconds stretch. Tomi sat opposite, her tea cooling untouched, her hands folded tightly in her lap like she didn't know where else to put them. Neither woman wore makeup. Neither looked like they were ready for a stage. They looked like what they were. 2 people stripped down to the ache beneath the noise, the old bruises that never healed right. For a long moment, neither spoke. Cars hissed by outside, tires slicing through wet streets. A man in a corner booth coughed once, then went back to his laptop. Somewhere deep inside the cafe, a dishwasher rattled trays. Ordinary life kept moving, unaware of the gravity sitting in that booth. Jasmine leaned forward finally, elbows on the table, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Let me ask you something," she said, her words slow, deliberate. Tomi looked up, wary, but didn't speak. Jasmine's eyes didn't soften. They sharpened. "Have you ever lost someone?" she asked. "Not to illness, not to accident. Lost someone because of what they looked like, because someone else decided they didn't belong." Tomi's hands tightened around the warm porcelain of her cup, knuckles going pale. For a moment she didn't answer. For a moment it seemed like she might bolt, might deflect, might armor up the way she always had. But there was no audience here to impress, no headlines to craft, only the truth, waiting like a weight across the table. She lowered her eyes to her tea, voice barely above a whisper. "My cousin," she said. The words came rough, like they hadn't been used in a long time. After September 11th, he wasn't even Arab, he was Armenian. But it didn't matter. She traced a line on the side of her cup with one shaking finger. Some guys at a gas station thought he looked Middle Eastern. They dragged him into the alley, beat him so bad his own mother couldn't recognize him for 2 days. Her voice cracked, just slightly. He didn't make it. The cafe noise seemed to fade around them, the hum of the world receding until it was just 2 people, 2 lives, 2 different kinds of grief sitting side by side. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't offer hollow sympathy. She let Tomi have the silence, the space to name what had never been spoken on air, never been wrapped in slogans or weaponized for clout. Just pain, raw and uneven, stripped of armor. Tomi looked up, and for the first time that afternoon, her face wasn't tight with defensiveness or wrapped in righteous anger. It was just tired, human. "Nobody ever got charged," she said, a hollow laugh slipping out. "They said it was a mistake, mistaken identity, wrong place, wrong time." She shook her head once, bitter and small, like it was his fault for looking wrong. Jasmine's hand stayed steady on the table, her face unreadable, but her chest rose slightly with a deeper breath, as if absorbing the shape of Tomi's grief into her own battered understanding of the world. After a long moment, she spoke, not softly, not to comfort, but with the same steel she had used on stage, reshaped now not for battle, but for honesty. "That's what it is," she said. "It's not about sides. It's about how easy it is to make someone disappear when you've decided they don't matter." Tomi nodded slowly, a short, tight jerk of her head, like she was afraid if she moved too much, the whole fragile thing between them would snap. No one said anything for a while after that. They just sat there. Two women who had spent years fighting from opposite hills, realizing maybe for the first time that the battlefield had never been clean lines of policy or opinion. It had been blood, and the blood didn't care what side you thought you were on. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Inside, the tension didn't break. It shifted, dense but different, like a storm that wasn't ending, but was moving deeper underground. Jasmine pushed her coffee aside finally, folding her hands together on the scratched wood table. Her voice when she spoke again was quieter, not forgiving, but real. "You're not the only one who's scared of losing people," she said. "The difference is, some of us never had the luxury of pretending it wasn't happening." Tomi didn't argue. She didn't snap back. She just sat there, blinking once, twice, breathing like someone who had been running for years and didn't know how to stop now that she finally could. The meeting didn't end with a handshake. It didn't end with a hug. It ended the way real things end, in unfinished sentences, in breaths held too long, in a silence neither woman tried to fill. When Jasmine stood gathering her coat with a slow, deliberate motion, Tomie stood too, not out of obligation, out of understanding. As Jasmine turned to leave, she looked back only once. Not for approval, not for apology, just a moment of recognition. A battlefield for once, with no winners, only survivors. The next time Jasmine Crockett spoke, she wasn't sitting across from one person anymore. She was standing in front of a nation still bleeding from wounds it refused to name. The lights above the stage were sharp, white, and unforgiving. They didn't soften the lines on Jasmine's face. They didn't blur the tension in her jaw. They didn't filter out the weariness tucked into her shoulders after carrying too many battles too long. They just shone, hard and clear, onto a woman who had already decided she wasn't here to be polished. She was here to be seen. The National Conference for Women of Color stretched out before her. Thousands of women, hundreds of cities, every generation represented in the sea of brown and black faces staring up at her now. Some were young, fists clenched tight around hope they hadn't yet learned to doubt. Some were older, arms crossed, eyes sharp, carrying decades of unspoken wars behind tight smiles. All of them waiting, breathing together, bracing for something they already knew would not be comfortable. Jasmine stepped up to the podium with no notes, no teleprompter, just her voice, worn smooth from use, and her body steady as a mountain that had outlived 1,000 storms. For a moment she said nothing. She let the silence stretch, testing its weight, feeling the pulse of it beat against the walls, the floors, the very air between her and them. Then when it felt right, not safe, but right, she spoke. "They call me a race baiter," Jasmine said, her voice cutting clean through the hush, clear and hard as a hammer striking stone. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. She let the words land exactly as they were meant to, unpolished, unrepentant. "They say it like it's a trap, like I'm casting nets to haul in anger, dragging it out of good people who would otherwise never think about color, about pain, about history." She paused, not for drama, but to let the sting of it breathe. No one moved, no one coughed. No one dared interrupt the weight of what was being built, word by word. "But here's the truth they don't want to admit," Jasmine continued, leaning slightly into the microphone, her hands gripping the edges of the podium like she was anchoring herself to the earth. "Maybe the nets were never mine to begin with. Maybe the anger was already here. Maybe the silence they mistook for peace was just fear lying still." She scanned the crowd, not quickly but carefully, making sure no one missed the next blow. "Maybe they're the ones who cast the nets, not to catch anger, but to trap silence, to hold it still, to stretch it tight around every broken system they didn't want to fix. And then blame us when the silence finally snapped. The audience held its breath. Some sat forward, gripping the arms of their chairs. Others blinked hard, the way people do when old pain starts pushing against their ribs again, demanding to be acknowledged. Jasmine's voice lowered, almost to a whisper, but somehow it carried further. They call me a race baiter, like it's an insult, like I should be ashamed of refusing to pretend the water isn't rising. Her throat tightened, but she pushed through it, steady, relentless. But if justice is a trap, if truth is something they designed to snap shut the moment we dared to walk toward it, then I'll be the bait. A murmur rippled through the room, small at first, then building, like the low rumble before a storm splits the sky. Jasmine didn't flinch. She gripped the moment tighter. If walking forward means risking the jaws, I'll walk first. If opening my mouth means stepping into the teeth, I'll speak first. If standing up means I'm the one who gets swallowed, then so be it. She straightened now, her voice climbing not in volume, but in certainty. Because maybe, just maybe, if someone walks into the trap and makes it snap loud enough, the people behind them will know where not to step. The first tear in the audience wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of tear that comes when someone finally puts into words the thing you've been trying not to admit to yourself for years. Jasmine didn't stop. She couldn't. I'll be the bait, she said again, softer now, almost like a vow. I'll take the hit. I'll make the noise. If it means the girl sitting in the back of a courtroom right now, wondering if anyone will believe her story, won't have to wonder someday. If it means the boy being pulled over for no reason tonight, won't have to rehearse how to survive it tomorrow. The applause didn't come all at once. It came in waves, messy and uneven, just like the fight itself. A woman near the front rose first, fists clenched at her sides. Then another, and another, until the whole room was on its feet, roaring, not just for Jasmine, but for themselves, for every memory, every hurt, every silence they had ever been asked to swallow whole. Jasmine stood at the podium, not smiling, not basking, just breathing, steady and slow, letting the roar pass through her like wind through an old oak. Outside the conference hall, journalists scribbled notes, cameras blinked, the city kept moving like nothing had changed. But inside, under those unforgiving lights, something had shifted. Not finished, not healed, but shifted. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't Jasmine who had to carry the whole weight alone. It was all of them. The applause hit her like a wave, thick and roaring, but Jasmine barely heard it anymore. She stepped back from the podium, blinking against the heat of the lights, her chest rising and falling in shallow, steady breaths. Hands reached out as she moved through the backstage corridor. A tap on the shoulder, a quick squeeze of her palm, a murmured, "You were brilliant." But it all blurred together, like moving through fog, like walking underwater. The roaring crowd behind her could have been 100 miles away. In her chest, only one thing pulsed, not victory, not triumph, a kind of heavy, dangerous stillness. A silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast, something she could no longer see the bottom of. Jasmine slipped past the crush of organizers without speaking. She moved through the side halls of the conference center, her heels muffled against industrial carpet, the ceiling lights buzzing faintly above her. No handlers, no cameras chasing her down for a quote. No aides wrapping a coat over her shoulders. She didn't want any of it. Not tonight. She needed the quiet. She needed the cold. The door at the end of the corridor swung open with a soft squeak, and the night swallowed her whole. Outside, DC breathed a different air. The conference center's neon signs threw pink and blue halos onto the wet pavement. Steam curled from sewer grates like the city itself was exhaling, slow and tired. Jasmine pulled her blazer tighter around herself as the chill cut through the silk blouse beneath it. She stood still for a long moment under the awning, the sounds of the city sliding into her. The soft rush of passing cars, the distant honk of a cab, the low murmur of two men arguing near a food cart down the block. It would have been easy to call a car, to slide into the back seat, to let tinted windows and soft leather insulate her from what she was feeling. But she didn't move. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, again and again. She didn't need to check it to know what it would say. Messages from campaign offices, news outlets, activists, maybe even a few enemies pretending to be friends now. Jasmine slid the phone out, turned it over once in her hand, and shoved it back into her pocket without answering. She started walking. The heels of her boots clicked sharply against the concrete, each step pulling her further away from the lights, from the noise, from the thousand staring eyes she had left behind. The sidewalks here were uneven, cracked in places where tree roots had shoved the stone upward. Storefronts blinked closed signs behind dirty glass. A man with a guitar case slung over his shoulder crossed the street ahead of her, never looking up. Jasmine kept walking, her breath leaving thin silver trails in the cold air. She let her thoughts untangle themselves with each step, let the adrenaline bleed out slowly from her fingertips. She thought about the women in that hall, the way they had stood, the way their faces had split open with something too big to name when she spoke. She thought about her mother, probably sitting by the TV at home, hands pressed over her mouth, tears slipping silently down her face. She thought about every girl who would wake up tomorrow and know, maybe for the first time, that telling the truth, even when it burned, could be survival, not surrender. And still, it didn't feel like victory. At the corner of 9th and P, Jasmine stopped. The old church there had gone dark hours ago, its heavy doors bolted shut, its steps slick with rain. She climbed them anyway, sitting on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees. From here, she could see the skyline curve against the bruised purple sky, the monuments glowing like hollow ghosts in the distance. She wondered how many speeches had been made in those stone buildings, how many promises broken, how many silences bought and sold. The city didn't care who won and who lost tonight. It never did. Jasmine pressed her forehead against her knees, letting the cold seep into her bones, into the ache settling deep in her chest. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, but she sat there a long time, breathing in the cold, breathing in the quiet, until the pulse in her ears slowed, until the noise inside her faded to something she could live with. This was what they didn't tell you about fighting. It wasn't just the standing tall on stage. It wasn't just the roaring applause, the headlines, the trending hashtags. It was this too, the aftermath, the loneliness, the way even victory could feel like grief when you realized how much more still needed to be said, still needed to be fought for. She thought about the word they had thrown at her, race baiter, like a brick. She thought about the way she had caught it, turned it in her hands and thrown it back sharpened into a blade. She thought about the women who had stood up for her, the children who had watched her, the enemies who had stayed silent, because for once there was no clever rebuttal clean enough to erase the truth. And she thought about the next fight, because there would be one. There was always another fight. Jasmine lifted her head finally, squinting up into the black sky. The rain had started again. Not hard, but steady, the kind of rain that soaks you slowly, without drama, without mercy. She let it fall onto her skin without moving. Let it wash the makeup from her cheeks, the sweat from her neck, the old blood from old battles. After a long time, she rose. The city moved around her, uncaring, unseeing. But she moved too, a shadow among shadows, a heartbeat among millions. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know how long the fire she had sparked would burn before someone tried to stamp it out. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going back. She wasn't stepping back into silence. Not now. Not ever. Jasmine shoved her hands into her coat pockets, squared her shoulders against the rain, and walked down the empty street, her figure shrinking into the mist, her steps steady and sure. And somewhere in the quiet, the world shifted a little more. The rain chased her down empty streets, cold and insistent, slicking her hair against her forehead and soaking through the thin fabric of her blazer. But Jasmine kept walking, steady and slow, like she was moving towards something only she could see. Every few blocks, a street light would flicker overhead, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. She welcomed the darkness. It felt honest. It didn't pretend. It didn't flatter. It simply was. At the edge of the next block, she stopped under an awning and finally let herself breathe. Her chest hurt from how long she had been holding it in. Not fear, not regret, Just wait. The heavy, irreversible gravity of knowing that once you tell the truth out loud, you don't get to take it back. Jasmine leaned against the wall, feeling the cold concrete at her back, and let her head tip back toward the dripping sky. Somewhere far away, car horns and late-night laughter floated up into the wet air. Life went on, messy and stubborn. She would have to go on too. The easy thing would be to stop now, to take the win, to accept the invitations flooding her inbox. TV panels, book deals, leadership summits full of polite applause and empty promises. She could pivot, soften, become the kind of symbol the world could celebrate without ever truly changing. She could step onto safer stages, polish her words until they no longer burned. She could become marketable. But Jasmine knew the price of that safety. It wasn't paid in applause. It was paid in silence, in self-erasure, in becoming another hollow statue people could nod to and then walk past without ever feeling a thing. She hadn't come this far to be safe. She thought about the girls in that hall tonight, the ones with notebooks clutched tight in their laps, who had stared up at her like she was holding open a door they thought had been locked forever. She thought about the boys she'd seen arrested at 15 for running too fast through the wrong neighborhood. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, thick with pride and old pain. She thought about her father's tired hands, calloused from work the world had never thanked him for. She thought about every time she had been told to wait, to be patient, to tone it down for the sake of unity. Jasmine straightened slowly, pushing off the wall, feeling the ache in her knees and her spine and her chest, the beautiful, brutal ache of being fully alive. She pulled her hood up against the rain and started walking again, each step deliberate, steady, carving a path through the quiet like a promise. She wasn't naive. She knew what came next. The backlash, the editorials twisting her words, the politicians smirking behind closed doors, the quiet blacklisting from rooms where decisions got made, the fake allies who would turn away when the cameras weren't looking, the ones who would call her too angry, too divisive, too much. Let them. She wasn't here to be comfortable. She was here to be the uncomfortable truth they couldn't unhear, the fire they couldn't ignore. Ahead, the fog thickened, swallowing the road into darkness. Jasmine kept walking straight into it, without hesitation. Not because she knew what waited on the other side, but because she knew who she was now. She was not the silence they had tried to build around her. She was not the insult they had tried to chain to her name. She was the match. And whether or not the world was ready, she was already lit. But in the end, Jasmine's story wasn't just about one woman standing alone in the rain. It was about what the storm left behind, once the world had no choice but to listen. The real lesson wasn't in the applause or the headlines. It was in the quiet violence of how easily truth is buried when it makes people uncomfortable, and how dangerous it is to tell it anyway. Jasmine taught us that courage isn't a roar. It's a choice made again and again, even when no one claps, even when the price is loneliness. She showed that being labeled divisive is often the cost of refusing to disappear. That survival isn't just breathing. It's refusing to shrink for a world built to erase you. Justice doesn't arrive clean or pretty. It arrives bloodied, breathless, clawing forward through walls designed to hold it back. Jasmine didn't burn down the system by screaming louder. She shattered it by refusing to lie about what it had always been. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is speak, clearly, relentlessly, even when your voice is the only one in the room. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.